Ah, automatic. I didn't even have to do it.
Look at that.
Look at that. What are the, let's see the participants. Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to give it a few seconds. I see people coming in as they log on. We do know that you're there. Let's see. So you're in the right place for Preservation North Carolina's Shelter series. My name is Gareth Evans. Julianne Patterson, who you normally see as a host on these, is off today. I work at the Bellamy Mansion Museum in Wilmington for Preservation North Carolina. And one of the tie-ins for this afternoon's presentation is the fact that we are also going through constantly actually revising what we do in terms of our interpretation in the same way as Blandwood is, which I think is a fascinating and never-ending kind of research opportunity for sites like this. So the Shelter series that we run for PNC is free virtual programming. We offer this to connect with preservationists across the state on a variety of topics. This is a webinar, so what that means on Zoom, we can't see you or hear you, but I do know that you're there because I can see a number on the screen. The benefit of being live is that we can still interact through questions at the end of this. If you want to ask a question as we go along this afternoon, please use the Q&A box, which you'll see at the bottom of the screen. I'll moderate those and ask Julian the questions when we get to that point, when he's done with the actual PowerPoint presentation. If you're having tech issues, I'll try and help if I can. Let me know in the chat box, which you'll also see at the bottom, presumably, of your screen, and I'll try my best. So a huge note of gratitude to those that added a donation to the registration today. This support, you know, for a nonprofit is invaluable. All our supporters are invaluable. It allows us to keep programming like this free. It also helps registrations and donations, memberships, and that kind of thing. Gets all the education that we do, Bellamy included, actually, but across PNC's programs throughout the year. So we're really very grateful to everybody who's donated, and please join or become a member in the future. So today's presentation is with Julian Price. He's a UNC-Greensboro student and a Blandwood Museum docent in Greensboro. We're going to learn more about the wider history of the Blandwood site and various people associated with the site throughout its history. We're going to discuss how they're incorporating political and social narratives around enslavement and abolition and industry into their interpretive plan that they're setting out for visitors who come and take the tours at Blandwood, which of course is something key to having a site like that in place-based learning. Julian is a student at the UNC-Greensboro. He's double majoring, very ambitious, in communication studies and African diaspora studies. He's born and raised in Charlotte with deep family roots extending through Greensboro and the Triad. Julian's invested lots of time and his interest in the African Americans forced to labor and reside in North Carolina. His passions outside history include music, cars, and poetry. He's been a docent at Blandwood since December and been into the research, the convoluted history of enslavement on the site and the surrounding region for that matter, to provide informed historical narratives to guests touring. He hopes that an informed public will be inclined to resist current injustices and advocate for the historically disadvantaged. I think we are ready to go in terms of all our tech. Julian, are you good on your end?
I'm good to go. Can you hear me?
I can hear you very well. I'm going to disappear from everybody's screen and leave it with you. Give me a shout if you need me. I'll see you at the end.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Gareth, for that introduction. Again, my name is Julian Price. I'm appreciative of all of you for attending this shelter series today. There are plenty of wonderful shelter series that occurred prior to me as well. So I would encourage you to watch those too. My shelter series is going to be called the Abolitionist Slaves. And so that may present as a sort of oxymoron, but that is a part of the convoluted history here at Blandwood. We have multiple intersecting histories that do contradict each other, and it's quite a task to sort through them and to provide historically accurate narratives amongst all of that. So with that said, I'm currently at Blandwood Museum. We're located at 447 West Washington Street in Greensboro, North Carolina, of course. So Blandwood was constructed by Charles Bland in 1795. It originally stood as a 4-room farmhouse. There were slaves that were held here on the campus of Blandwood, but they were not numerous. There would have been a few originally for some domestic work and for work around the house that Charles Bland would have assigned them. Bland stayed for a couple of years with his family and eventually sold the home to the Humphreys, Henry and Letty Humphrey, who moved in the early 19th century. The Humphreys ended up staying for a couple of years themselves, and they added their own addition to the home in 1822, which included a bedroom on the bottom floor and 2 bedrooms on the top floor. So the Humphreys stayed until 1827 when they sold the home to a young Moorhead couple. And the connection between the Humphreys and the Moorheads is that the Humphreys were the parents-in-law of John Motley Moorhead and Ann Eliza. So we have here a picture of the rear of Blandwood. So in the middle, we can see this is the original 4-room farmhouse portion of the home built by Charles Bland. To our right, we see the 1822 addition that was made by the Humphreys. And on the left, excuse me, we see the addition that was made in 1844. This along with the prominent front fascia that we see here is designed by prominent New York architect A.J. Davis. That's Andrew Jackson Davis. Davis was famous for introducing America to the Italianate villa-style home, of which Blandwood is actually the oldest in the country. This is a style that was meant to mimic the style of old Greek homes and the European structures that were prominent in the 18th and 19th centuries in Europe. Governor Moorhead ended up contracting A.J. Davis for $100 to build the home, or to design the home, and then it was later built in a number of years as he was governor serving in North Carolina. A.J. Davis also designed a number of prominent buildings elsewhere in North Carolina, including work on the state capitol and buildings on the campus of UNC Chapel Hill. Other things to note about Governor Moorhead that are important. He was born in Virginia. His family moved to Rockingham County when he was 2, where he remained until he went off to school in 1817 and graduated as a part of the class of 1817 for University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. After graduating, Governor Moorhead remained involved in politics in Rockingham County. He did end up moving back there with his newly found wife, Ann Eliza Moorhead. And he became involved in the House of Commons in Rockingham County, specifically in Wentworth, before eventually moving on to Greensboro in 1827, where he became involved in the House of Commons there as well. And then he eventually, of course, went out for the governorship in 1840, and ended up serving from 1841 to 1845 as the governor. Now, Governor John Motley Moorhead himself enslaved upwards of 30 people at one time on the premises of Blandwood, which makes for an interesting history because his political history would seem to contradict his personal life quite strongly. So here we have an excerpt of a newspaper article that was written about John Motley. And it reads, "How stands the case as to Mr. Moorhead? By our old Constitution, free Negroes were allowed to vote. It was proposed in convention to take away this right when John Motley Moorhead himself proposed to allow all free Negroes to vote who should hold property to the value of $250. And this being rejected, he voted for every other proposition favorable to free Negroes. Mr. Van Buren," that's the 8th president of the United States, Van Buren, "resided in a state where slavery was not tolerated. Mr. Moorhead in one where it existed. These are the facts on which we ground our belief that John Motley Moorhead is a state abolitionist." So this is what inspires our title, The Abolitionists' Slaves. So John Motley Moorhead is considered and charged for being an abolitionist by his political rivals and opponents, even though he is a large slaveholder in Guilford County, and likely had other slaves that he housed elsewhere. Here we see another news article. This is from the Tarboro Press, 1840. "John Motley Moorhead voted to allow to free Negroes the right of suffrage. He voted against the bill to prevent the migration of free Negroes into the state. He voted against the bill to prevent the education of slaves and free Negroes. He voted against the bill to restrain trading with slaves. He voted against the bill for draining Madame Musquet." I hope that I'm saying that right. If not, then apologies to everyone who cares deeply about that lake. "He voted against annual sessions of the legislature." So this is an article that's premiering in 1840. This is the prime of his campaign for the governorship. Of course, he served 1841 to 1845. So his political opponents, which would have been conservative Democrats at the time, are charging John Motley Moorhead with voting against the interests of the slaveholders, which was in direct violation of his own interests as well, naturally. And John Motley Moorhead responds interestingly to this because his primary constituents in Greensboro, that is, are the Quakers. And the Quakers, of course, are known for their history of resisting enslavement and of resisting practices to further deliberate the lives of freed African Americans in North Carolina and elsewhere as well. Another newspaper article reads, "This is a list of factories now being built. One at Rockfish near Fayetteville, a fine water company, water power owned by a company. One near Rockingham in Richmond County, water power owned by a company. One on Deep River near Asheboro, owned by a company. One near Leakesville on Dan River, building of stone, owned by John Motley Moorhead. One in Surry County on Hunting Creek, owned by Mr. Doucet, I believe. One on the Yadkin, a few miles below Stokes Ferry in Montgomery County, owned by Mr. Edward Burridge and Company. One on the South Yadkin River, 10 miles northwest of Salisbury, owned by Fisher and Limley." So also prominent in the newspapers was the industrial pursuit of Governor Moorhead, even prior to him becoming a governor. He was heavily involved in industrializing areas near major waterways, as well as the railroad, which he headed off the North Carolina Railroad Association, which was incredibly instrumental in developing further developing eastern North Carolina as well as the Piedmont, as this made travel from one to the other that much quicker. Originally, that would have taken several days. The travel from, say, Greensboro to what became Morehead City would have been a several days trip on very rough roads, questionable terrain to say the least. And after the railroad was introduced, that became a day's travel with a couple of stops in town. So, of course, the towns that were stops on the railroad were benefited as well. And of course, this would have been primarily enslaved labor that was relied on to develop not just these industrial pursuits around waterways, but the railroad as well. We do have documentation that shows us that Governor John Motley Morehead would not only use enslaved persons to build the railroad, which ended up running through his backyard effectively, but he would rent them out to private developers and other people with personal pursuits for something like $1 a day. So if you could imagine your labor being bought and sold for $1 a day, and you not seeing any of that. This is the reality of being an enslaved person, not just in North Carolina, but in the broader South and in the North prior to northern states doing away with enslavement as well. So if we remember the practice of importing slaves from Africa was made illegal in 1808, which is the same year that Greensboro was made a township. So prior to 1808, slaves were imported loosely through the ports in Wilmington area, and particularly in Charleston, South Carolina, as well as some in Virginia as well. But these were primarily enslaved persons that were living in smaller non-plantation style housing and settings. Greensboro did not have a plantation economy like, say, Georgia or parts of South Carolina had. The population of Greensboro until 1860 roughly was around 1,000 people, give or take some for enslaved persons that would not have been mentioned through the census, of course. But when you consider the population and the labor that was relied on to develop the fast-growing region of the South that was the Mid-Atlantic, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, etc., none of this would have been possible without depriving enslaved persons of their liberties and selling and buying their labor. Excuse me. So it's interesting to reconcile the history of John Motley Morehead's enslavement of African Americans with that of his brother, James Turner, that is. Both were politicians. James Turner himself was involved with city council and became involved with the North Carolina Senate later in his political career. But James Turner was one of the few that did have a plantation, and this warranted his enslavement of, in the 1860 census, 107 people. So the location of his plantation we can see is what used to be the intersection of Sycamore to the north, Ash Street to the west, Washington Street to the south, and Green Street to the east. This is not an intersection that now exists. We can think of this as roughly being in the area of the Civil Rights Museum and on February 1 Place in downtown Greensboro. We can look at the houses that are pictured here and see that the construction is somewhat different from houses that were around them. We can see what we believe to be enslaved quarters on the perimeter that would have been brick. And quarters for the main house as well. That would have been a combination of brick and wood. But understanding that the plantation economy that supported James Turner was not what supported John Motley Moorhead, and that the two brothers, even though they lived 1,000 feet away from each other, were attaining revenue in vastly different ways is of the utmost importance here. So what we can see here is a slave schedule. This is an 1860 slave schedule that lists out persons, generally speaking, enslaved by John Motley Moorhead, Letitia Walker, and this other person, John Cole. So John Motley Moorhead has 16 people listed in this 1860 slave schedule. His enslavement of upwards of 30 people would have been closer to 1850 as the 1850s progressed and we got closer to the time period of the Civil War. It's unclear whether he sold persons off or what caused the decrease of the enslaved population, but it did decrease down to 16 at that time. We see 9 persons enslaved here that were listed as female and 8 persons that were listed as male. Females were ranging from the age of 3 to 105. Male persons were ranging from the ages of 4 to 60 years old. So a pretty wide range of ages of the enslaved population in this 1860 slave schedule for John Motley. Prior to this, in the closer to 1850 time range, far more of the population of enslaved persons on the campus of Blandwood would have been under the age of 18. Something like 16 to 18 persons would have been under the age of 18, primarily female. It's unclear whether their parents would have lived on the premises of Blandwood and the children would have simply been allowed to stay, or if these were children that were purchased specifically by John Motley Moorhead as children to be raised doing domestic work at Blandwood. But something else interesting of note is that they're all listed as Black. So we can see here that there are categories for understanding the makeup of these enslaved persons. You have age here, you have sex here as the second column, and you have color here as this third column. Everyone in this category is listed as Black. If we move down to Letitia Walker's schedule of enslaved persons, we see that she's listed as having 44 persons enslaved to her. This was a combination of the persons that she inherited as enslaved from her father and those that she inherited from her husband, Samuel Walker. They did have a plantation west of Greensboro, close to a waterway as well. But you do see that there are persons listed here that are both Black and the W, which indicates, the M, which indicates mulatto. So it's unclear why there would have been the possession of mulatto persons by Letitia Walker and not by John Motley Moorhead, or if there were persons that were Black and mulatto or vice versa that were listed incorrectly in either one. This makes us weary of all of the details that we receive from things like slave schedules. We don't know whether there was a person that was surveying in 1860 who took note of every one of the enslaved persons and actually had conversation or laid eyes on the enslaved persons that they charted, or if they took a general account from the enslaver who would have given them details, possibly incorrect details about age and color and sex, things of that nature. So at Blandwood, we did have the privilege of an archaeological dig in 2011 that was headed by Dr. Linda Stein. of the archaeological department at UNCG. They did rummage through the swept yard portion and other areas near the kitchen and the yard at Blandwood. And one of the things of note that they found was a blue bead. So this bead is believed to have, excuse me, this bead is believed to have belonged to a younger enslaved woman, female, if you will. It's hard to tell anything about who this bead belonged to. We don't have names, of course. We don't have the luxury of historical accounts of someone losing a bead or anything like that. But it's simply having this is it's inspiring, to say the least. It allows us to peek into the material world of the enslaved at Blandwood and what their experiences would have been. Another thing that helps us in that pursuit is our kitchen. We have two dependencies here at Blandwood that extend off of the main house. We have our kitchen to one side and the law office, which is where I currently am, to the other side. The kitchen and law office were both reconstructed in the 1980s by Preservation Greensboro, based on architectural renderings that we had and archaeological information that we had as well. That gave us information on what those buildings would have looked like. So they've been recreated to the best of Preservation Greensboro's ability. And we have items like a stove included with a waffle maker, and certain other pots and pans and items that enslaved persons would have used to labor in the kitchen and elsewhere. The kitchen is of particular importance because it would have been not just a place for preparing meals and for the slaughtering of animals to be prepared, but the upstairs portion is what we believe is also what would have been used to house enslaved persons. So if you can imagine upwards of 30 people at one time residing in an upstairs area that was a few hundred square feet, if that. Deplorable conditions, to say the least. But we do have that kitchen recreated for our reimagination of what history would have presented to enslaved persons at the time. We have this bead. It gives us a glimpse into what a younger enslaved female would have worn in her hair. And it's a cool glimpse into the past for me. Another historical artifact that we can look into, historical documents, include cohabitation records of formerly enslaved persons from 1866 to 1868. So of course, prior to 1866, prior to the official emancipation of persons in the South, enslaved persons' marriages would not have been legally recognized by North Carolina and most other states in the South. And so transitioning into the legalization of marriage, we had in that between period cohabitation, which is where a male and a female African-American would have been permitted to live together. And it would have had to be documented that they were living together, when they began living together, and who else was in the household. So we see names along this list. I encourage anyone who is the descendant of an enslaved person, or anyone who's interested in that history as well, to look through cohabitation records, which can be found both through your county and through state archival records. This is an incredibly valuable resource to get a glimpse into what stands in the gap of marriage records from the 19th century. This is how we were able to see the record of cohabitation of one of our formerly enslaved persons here at Blandwood by the name of Hannah Jones. In the final will and testament of Annalisa Moorhead, the wife of Governor John Motley Moorhead, she left items of her belongings to family members. And outside of family members, there were only two people that she left things to. That was Tenon Moorhead and Hannah Jones. We see here, it's difficult to make out, but it says, "I give and bequeath to my faithful servant, Hannah Jones." This is a whatnot that she leaves, a table, and a bedstead. So items bequeathed in this will, Annalisa Moorhead to her formerly enslaved. Also, I give and bequeath to my freedman, Tenon Moorhead. Items she left to him included a pair of boots and some other furniture, another bedstead. So it's important to note that Hannah Jones, one of the two people that is mentioned in this will that was formerly enslaved by the Moorheads at Blandwood, she remained living here at Blandwood until 1873, roughly, when the youngest child, Eugene Moorhead, ended up moving out. Annalisa died in 1866. John Motley Moorhead preceded her in death by 2 years in 1860. In 1868, Annalisa Moorhead passed, and John Motley Moorhead preceded her in death by 2 years in 1866. And Hannah Jones stayed for 7 to 8 years after that. Why she stayed, we do not know. We don't have diary entries. We don't know if she was literate. We don't know if there were any accommodations made, like wages, or if she was simply staying on the land because it was free. We don't know what type of labor she would have done after she was emancipated and living here, but we know that she resided here with her children and with her first husband, Ed Doak, and then for a short time with her second husband, Samuel Jones. We know that we know that Tenon also would have resided for a short period after emancipation, though the history that we have about Tenon is far less complete. That's one of the many pursuits that we continue researching at Blandwood. So if you come in for a tour in 2 or 3 years, hopefully we will have that information at hand. This is the family tree for Hannah Jones. We have the wonderful resource of ancestry.com to make up a family tree like this. So we see her first marriage with a Jack Doak. Little is known about Jack Doak. We believe that he was possibly the descendant of a white enslaver in the region, in the area. Little is known about Samuel Jones as well. We believe that he was enslaved in the area as well. We know that he was a smith of sorts. He was experienced with wagons and with tool making. We know that Hannah gave birth to 3 children. That was Edward Doak, John Jones, and Ann Jones. We know who Edward Doak and John Jones married, being Katie Adams and Sally Childress. And we have information about Hannah Jones's grandchildren as well, which is an incredibly, incredibly valuable thing to have. We have here the US Census, which proves that Hannah was still residing at Blandwood by 1870. Here we see Hannah Jones listed as 47 at the time, listed as a domestic servant in the household. Why she will stay has remained a question that presents to me every time I step into the house, every time I give a tour. And that's something that we may never know unless we find a diary somewhere or some information presents itself. We're still waiting for that moment. If you take note of other categories in the federal census, you'll see it lists place of birth, which is unknown for Hannah. It lists parentage, which remains unknown as well. Education, of course, would not have been applicable to Hannah Jones as far as we know. It gives a special category for those that are deaf, dumb, blind, insane, or idiotic, which a large portion of enslaved persons by the 1870 census were actually listed as insane, dumb, or idiotic. Just an interesting point to note. Unclear why that categorization would have been assigned. There's no note taking by the census keepers. The census keepers would have been largely uneducated themselves. So it's interesting that they would have had that categorization. So the final bit of information that we have about Hannah Jones begins with her death. So her death was so major, in fact, that it made the Greensboro Patriot newspaper. This is an article from March 6, 1895, which reads, "An old colored woman named Hannah Jones, living in Warnersville, fell into the fire last Thursday evening while alone in the house, and she was not discovered until the next day. And by that time, she was fearfully burned, and it was not thought at first that she would live. But since then, she has begun to recover." So to have a newspaper clipping of a formerly enslaved person who was enslaved here at Blandwood is incredible. Unfortunately, Hannah did succumb to her injuries as a result of the house fire. She died just a few days after this article would have been published. And we do have the luxury of seeing her will. So in her will, she left a few items to her children. We were able to find out that Hannah Jones did, after leaving Blandwood, move to the historic town of Warnersville, which deserves its own shelter series by itself. Hopefully that's something that someone can do. But the historic town of Warnersville started in 1865 by Yardley Warner, was created specifically for the newly freed, formerly enslaved persons. This is a neighborhood that's just 2 miles down the road from Blandwood. It was originally 35 acres of land that Yardley Warner purchased and it eventually sold to residents like Hannah Jones and Tenon Moorhead, who we know spent some time at Warnersville as well. But to recognize Hannah Jones as an early resident of this historic Black town and a formerly enslaved person at Blandwood, invaluable. Warnersville went on to grow substantially into a large Black neighborhood, which was self-sustaining. It had its own churches, it had its own buildings, it had its own businesses and neighborhoods, houses within the neighborhood that were mostly owned by the residents. That changed vastly in the 1960s during the Reconstruction period, during the period of urban renewal, when countless Black historic homes were destroyed in efforts to urbanize. This is an effort that's been seen by some as good and by others as a great evil. It was admitted by early Warnersville residents that many of the structures were dilapidated and in need of renewal. But the tearing down of that community and replacing with homes that were largely owned by white renters who ended up living outside of the neighborhood and renting to Black folks. That's been a great travesty on its own. I have a special connection to Warnersville, as my great-grandmother actually lived there from 1969 to her death in 2020. I would visit her frequently. She had some of the greatest cornbread you could imagine, and other dishes that I unfortunately wasn't able to taste. But Hannah Jones, thinking about Hannah Jones always reminds me of her, as they were residents of the same neighborhood, but on different ends of it. Hannah Jones was a very early resident. My grandmother, a resident immediately after urban renewal. So to touch on a little bit of Greensboro history after the period of enslavement, this is a Greensboro disenfranchisement list dating back to roughly 1890, or in the mid 1890s. These are all names of enslaved persons, formerly enslaved persons and freed Black persons by the 1890s, who would have been prevented from voting by the largely conservative Democrat Party in Greensboro. Many of these names are preachers or are Black men that would have sought out political candidacy themselves. Others are simply residents that would have inspired fear in the hearts of these list makers. Some of the names that are on this list, which is admittedly hard to make out, are listed twice. This tells us a little bit about the list makers themselves, that they would have been largely uneducated, as we would presume, and would have likely been constructing these lists out of pure anger, simply reacting to African Americans not only acquiring land in the area, but acquiring political candidacy as well. And this disenfranchisement list is the beginning of a long history of disenfranchisement, not just in Greensboro, but elsewhere. Reports have stated that Black people constitute 21% of the voting age in North Carolina and represent 42% of the people disenfranchised, whether through probation, parole, supervision, or other restrictive forces. So felony disenfranchisement is nothing new, and it's something that can be traced back to this disenfranchisement list from the 1890s, which is incredible. So quickly, we'll touch on the Quaker influence over Greensboro, because this is a very important aspect of Greensboro's development. So pictured here are Delphina and George C. Mendenhall, who have a very interesting story. So George C. Mendenhall was raised as a Quaker in Greensboro. He went on to attend UNC Chapel Hill in the same class as John Motley Moorhead, in fact, which is where they met and became similarly minded and similar in political pursuits. So George inherits slaves from his first marriage to Eliza Dunn, who was not a Quaker. And this caused much outrage in the Quaker community, of which George C. Mendenhall was a part, and that eventually led to him being ousted out of the community. He was disowned from the Quaker community in Greensboro for owning slaves. It's unclear what his original thought process was when inheriting these slaves from his first marriage to Eliza Dunn, who eventually succumbed to illness. But George C. Mendenhall became one of the largest enslavers in the Piedmont of North Carolina. And he became a part of several of the related Quaker organizations, including the NC quarterly meetings, the North Carolina Manumission Society, and others. And these societies, as well as George C. Mendenhall's pursuit on its own, were intended to emancipate people without going through the legal process of emancipation. So the quarterly and yearly meetings and the Manumission Society and things would actually allow members to put their slaves into the holding of the meeting, and then the meeting itself could dictate what happened with the persons enslaved inside them. That's an interesting piece of history about Quakers, and Delphina is particularly interesting, as she had a street named after her, which is now Guilford College Ave. But Delphina was responsible for illegally freeing numerous enslaved persons, many of which were the persons enslaved by George C. Mendenhall, inherited by Eliza Dunn, and others who would come to George C. Mendenhall asking for him to actually purchase them so that they wouldn't be transported away from their families or sent deeper into the South where the conditions were more deplorable. So the pursuits of George C. Mendenhall and Delphina Mendenhall were challenged by persons outside of the Quaker community and within the Quaker community itself. But it's important to note that their efforts as slave owners and slave holders was not what we would expect given the general narratives of enslavement, especially enslavement on a large scale, as George C. Mendenhall would have owned dozens of slaves at one time. Delphina as well. This is a depiction of the street formerly known as Delphina Street, which is now Guilford Avenue. And I want to end by mentioning how to commemorate persons enslaved at Blandwood and elsewhere by talking about our garden for Hannah Jones. As we see here, this is a garden that's been erected and kept up by Preservation Greensboro and by those they partnered with. Originally, this area, which is in the middle of the walkway between the main house, which you'll see to the left, and the kitchen, which you'll partially see to the right. Originally, this area would have been a swept yard meant for cooking and cleaning and transporting items between the kitchen and the main house. It would have been dirt. There would not have been a garden here. There possibly would have been herbs grown or other items on large scale grown here. We've decided, Preservation Greensboro has decided to use this as a garden to commemorate the memory of Hannah Jones. So we have a sign that's going to be going up, giving some details on Hannah's life. There'll be a QR code on the sign that will be able to provide you with more information about Hannah Jones and about Blandwood. But there are some things that we're left with, some unfortunate truths and fortunate truths. Unfortunate truths include the fact that most of what we know about enslaved Africans in America is by way of documentation of their white enslavers. So that history is inseparable of enslavers and the enslaved. Another unfortunate truth is that documents have burned or disappeared or remain stashed in attics for no one to see. And so until we find those lost documents, there's so much information that we'll never have access to. So if you do have any information, any documents sitting in your attic or sitting in an area close to you, please do submit them to a museum or someone who is studying historic documents so that they can be shared with the public. Even valuable resources like the WPA slave interviews, which were conducted in 1937, proved to be challenging, as we have to understand that enslaved persons, formerly enslaved persons who were conducting these interviews with white interviewers in 1930s North Carolina would have had a number of reasons to omit information or to leave things out or to simply not recount aspects of their lives that are too traumatic to mention to a white interviewer that you just met. So all of these barriers exist between us and formerly enslaved persons that prevent us from learning far more about their lives. The fortunate truths are that we have resources like Blandwood, which is a historic site that's committed to learning as much as we can about the lives of enslaved persons here. Again, this is not a space simply to commemorate the life of Governor John Motley Moorhead or the Moorhead family. This is a space to learn as much as we can about the history dating back to the 18th century and progressing forward that has its number of complications and contradictions, and to approach that honestly as historians and persons invested in the historic spaces. We have the firsthand narratives, however complex and challenging they may be to analyze. We have the marriage cohabitation records. We have Black Warnersville and other towns like it, even if many of the historic structures are no longer in existence in the towns, we do have those histories that we can reflect on when we get the chance. So I encourage you with that to come and take a tour at Blandwood, to tour other historic sites and historic homes and museums, to donate as well, so that we can continue these pursuits and learn as much as we can about this extremely complex era and element of American history.
Well, I came back on. That was fascinating. Thanks very much, Julian.
Thank you.
There are a number of questions, unsurprisingly, after all that. Yeah. Got some water there? Good. That's just fascinating. It makes me think, which you said a couple of times, there's so much more, right? There's so much more to do. And maybe we won't find it all, but you keep turning things up. The Hannah story is fascinating. That's a real insight into somebody's life in that setting. We've got a couple of questions here. One I wanted to ask, which I think a few people are sort of alluding to. On that ancestry.com family tree, you going any further down that tree? Have you found anybody? Has anybody come forward, ancestors in a current generation or anything like that?
With regard to Hannah or others?
Anybody, I suppose, really is an answer. I was thinking about Hannah, but yeah, anybody who's currently around. I know we have family members at Bellamy going back to the original Bellamy's on that side, and we often come across African-American Bellamy's, often probably from an enslaved a plantation life in South Carolina. So I wonder if you come across anybody.
Yeah. So as far as Hannah's bloodline, it's difficult to trace past her grandchildren. So as far as Napoleon and other grandchildren through her two other children, it's difficult to trace past there. We believe that Napoleon may have, I believe he died in 1941. We believe he may have died in World War II or at least around that time. And we don't have much documentation as of yet following after that. There have been other lines that are theoretical as far as descendants of Hannah and Tenon, that some of which extend to today. I won't mention names for credibility's sake, but that's a pursuit that's definitely continuing. We're trying to learn as much as we can about descendants of Hannah and Tenon and everyone else who was enslaved here.
Yeah, yeah, we're doing the same thing.
Absolutely.
It's a search worth doing. I'm just going to say I was struck that insane, dumb, idiotic thing. That categorization, it's not a question. I'd never seen that before. And that said so much about the people who were writing that.
Yes.
That really jumped out at me anyway.
Yes.
Give a couple of questions off the list. The original newspapers that kind of were trying to paint Moorhead as a progressive of all things. What was the date, and maybe the name of the newspaper that came from?
So I do believe those were the Greensboro Patriot. I don't have the date exactly, but I suspect roughly 1840s.
Okay. Yeah.
So if I can I can roughly state that it was around the time of his governorship.
Right. So probably a political,
Political opponents, adversaries.
Exactly. How did he make his money? Exactly, Moorhead.
Yes. So, in fact, Governor Moorhead was involved, as we mentioned, in the railroad. He was a lawyer who was well-renowned in Rockingham County and in Guilford County as well. He was also an investor. He was involved in banking. He was involved in industry. But the bulk of the Moorhead wealth actually came from Annalisa and her family. So as we mentioned, the Humphreys were Annalisa's parents-in-law, actually. And so they came into money as well. I'm not sure exactly where their money comes from, but she inherited a great deal of that, which is another reason why we say that Governor John Motley Moorhead was greatly inspired by Annalisa in his political pursuits, because a lot of this was her money.
Right.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Do you have any idea who the 105-year-old blind woman, I think it was, in the 1860 census? Any note on that person, like tangentially in a paper? And nothing.
We dig, and we try to find any connection between this 105-year-old woman. We know that she was blind.
Yeah.
We know nothing else about her. We know that she was emancipated before death, but we don't know what her name was. We don't know where she was from or how long she had been enslaved by the Moorheads. That's information that, again, we continue to seek through any resources we can find.
Hopefully somebody watching, right?
Right.
A couple of notes that North Carolina in that manifest, and then DO for ditto that followed. So Hannah Jones is North Carolinian. There any other disenfranchisement lists you've come across for towns and counties?
Yeah, so I know that there are disenfranchisement lists in Raleigh and Durham. I believe that I've seen disenfranchisement documents in Charlotte as well. Most counties would have something similar to a disenfranchisement list. Even if the documents don't still exist, we can imagine that these would have been spread widely across North Carolina. I know that you, as working at the Bellamy Mansion in Wilmington,
Right.
do have a connection to the Wilmington riots taking place in 1898.
Yeah.
So the same type of racist, violent, political action by conservative, primarily Democrats at the time, would have been rampant throughout the state and throughout the South. So these disenfranchisement lists are definitely not rare.
Right. No, they're not. And down here there are equally blatant things all the way up into, the coup and the massacre of 1898 and everything that followed that. We were looking at that in the office today. Actually, it's not subtle. Nobody hid it. They just out and out said, we're white supremacists and this is what we're going to do. A lot of that written down. Oh, somebody noticed there's a J.C. Price Lane in Warnersville. Any relation, I suppose?
Not that I know of.
Not that you
I know that
of.
I believe that JC, I don't remember exactly where that JC Price was from, but I'll claim that we have nameship in common at the least,
Right.
but no familial relation.
I got a question here with it's asking about concessions and political ideologies that African Americans had to subscribe to in order to coexist with whites in rural areas. I mean, do you know how, maybe more specific to the folks you know at Blandwood there, how did they manage to go about life in this period in the face of so much racism and enslavement, of course? Got any idea on that?
Yeah. So I think the greatest resource that we have to look at the concessions that were made by Black people at the time is, again, the WPA slave narratives that were conducted. Excuse me. Of course, again, these leave out a lot of information about people's realities, but we're able to learn, what people were, what rationalizations people were making about enslavement at the time. Often in those narratives, people would say that enslavement was not that bad, or that they actually sided with, as they would call them, the Rebs, the rebel army, or there would be admissions of how the Yankees came to plantation houses or to the houses of enslavers and ended up stealing goods, stealing items that belonged to both to enslavers and to the enslaved. So we know things like that informed what people were thinking about politically and socially. But again, these are things where even by the time of their death, many of these persons enslaved would have never become literate. So we don't have diary entries. We don't have their words to trace back political preferences and ideological beliefs.
That makes sense. Yeah, I know you showed that map, the sort of schematic of the town. How rural was Greensboro at the time? I mean, I'm trying to think. From that map, I was trying to think how many of the buildings on his brother's place and further in, how many of those were slave quarters, perhaps behind the buildings? I know for Wilmington, most of the larger houses would have had either people living upstairs in the attic or in the basement or somewhere, or in a building outside. And that led me to wonder what the racial sort of breakdown was in terms of numbers around the Civil War there, and where everybody was living. Were they all really together? Was there a lot of plantations way out, or how did it look?
Yeah. So Greensboro would have definitely been very, very rural. The entire state of North Carolina was rural until the industrial boom in the 1880s and 1890s. Population would have been under 2,000 people. They would have been spread pretty widely. I mean, it would have been easy to get land, but travel would have been difficult. So people would have stayed in their specific pockets. Prior to the Civil War, the township of Greensboro, that is the immediate downtown area, would have had a couple of residents near Blandwood within a couple of miles. There would have been a small community of persons in what we would consider now like an urban living space that would have been somewhere in the general area of the where the courthouse sits. But otherwise, it would have been primarily rural with miles and miles of land that was relatively difficult to sustain, which is, again, part of why this wouldn't have been a plantation economy here.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Now you said 2,000 people and spread out. That makes it quite clear to get that through. I'm trying to. Were there any prices on that manifest or anything connected with it?
On the manifest, I didn't see any on the 1860 slave
I
schedule.
didn't see any on that. I wonder if there's any anywhere else. I'm sure you would have shown it if there were.
I haven't found any anywhere.
Okay.
I also haven't looked. I know that my parents have conducted some research into our ancestry, into the Prices and into other surnames.
Oh, wait. Sorry. I didn't mean that. I meant cost, as in a numerical figure attached to the buying and selling of enslaved people. That's what I was going.
Okay. Slightly confusing. Okay, gotcha.
No, I did that to you. Yeah.
So no, on this slave schedule, there would not have been a price listed. The only prices that I've seen listed have been related to Letitia and her husband, the Walkers, buying and selling what would have been referred to as bucks, or black male laborers for around $300 to $500. And again, the renting of those enslaved men out to other persons as well for something like $300 a year, which equates roughly to $1 a day.
Right. That can be, we have one manifest with some amounts, prices on it, and it's fascinating to see that disparity between how much money they put in the buying and selling of people. All right, we'll move through some of these others. Moorhead's religion, and was he involved? Was he very religious, pious kind of person? Not a Quaker, presumably.
He was not an established Quaker. He was not a part of the Quaker meetings. It was said that he did have a coming to God, if you will, at the end of his life. In the last couple months of his life, he was rather sickly. He and Analyzer were both rather sickly, and so it was said that John Motley Moorhead changed his ways considerably. We don't know if that was behaviorally or religiously or a combination of multiple, but we can presume that he was loosely associated with the Quaker ideology, and his religious beliefs would have coincided loosely with that as well.
Right. Okay. You said another question here is what was grown on the Moorhead's plantation, and 100 enslaved, but he had 30, right? And 100 was his brother. Was that right?
Yes, his brother had 107 enslaved. At the height of enslavement for John Motley Moorhead and Analyza, they would have had around 30 to 35 enslaved persons.
Yeah, right.
What would have been grown here, we don't have complete documentation of the crops that were grown here. We have indication that there was an apple grove, so there would have been apple trees, likely some grains, some wheats, barley, likely hay for a small amount of livestock that would have been present here. But again, it wasn't a plantation, so there were no large cash crops like cotton or corn, at least not in large amounts.
This person also mentioned Benjamin Briggs, who's the director at Blandwood, had mentioned on a tour that there were some enslaved quarters in front of City Hall. She's throwing that in there. Oh, this is okay. How do you deal with difficult visitor comments along the lines of they must have been good slave owners? And I can talk about this for a while, but please, you do it.
Well, I think what I have to continue reminding myself is that the time period was incredibly different in 1860 from how it is today. There were Quakers that lost their lives, both persons who enslaved other people with the interest of freeing them or simply providing them a quote unquote better life. And there were others that were not enslavers at all, who lost their lives simply for speaking, for protesting in a largely conservative space where ideologies differed vastly from theirs. So I think about how difficult it would be to simply stand on my moral ground as an African American or as a Black person in the 21st century who's never been enslaved and has never had to deal with a society that relies on enslavement. And it's difficult. It's difficult. I'll say that. It's very difficult.
Yeah, that's well put. Sometimes you have, well, I'll just say that for me, I'm sometimes don't want to be nice about that sort of a question when I know where it's coming from, particularly in the context of other questions around it. But it is a public facing tour institution, so it is difficult to do that. How many names are known of slaves connected to Blandwood, besides the couple you've named, obviously?
Yeah, so the two that we have are the only two that we can confirm right now. The two that are listed in Analyza Moorhead's will, Hannah Jones and Tenon Moorhead. We've found other documents with names of enslaved persons that we can't confirm were enslaved here. So those two are the two that we can say surely were enslaved here.
Can you go back to the slave schedule a minute? Somebody was asking what the
Yes.
fourth column was, and they can read that while we have a look. The fourth column.
So the fourth column, excuse me, I'm trying to see it myself.
Are we talking about the one which denotes black, or are we talking about over there? Oh,
so I'm assuming they're talking about this column. I can't make it out from this angle. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what that.
or which one we're talking about. Maybe if somebody wants to, hey, do you have your email address kicking around? Because there's some longer questions with some interpretive issues here, and maybe some people could email you and ask you some more detailed stuff like that, because we're all on the screen. We know how it goes.
Absolutely. I'm going to type in my email address in the chat. So if anybody has other questions, other lengthy questions, I can answer to the best of my ability.
There's a few more I've got here, but some of those are getting long. And Terry on here is asking, how to representation questions, how to best find information through wills and other things. It's a research question, that one in particular. Maybe you can get into that one. Claudia Stack, how has researching this history affected you personally? Great work.
Yeah. So I'll start with the second question. I guess the two kind of connect because a large portion of the research we do, of course, diving into wills and cohabitation records, marriage records, and specifically looking at enslaved narratives where they detail, at least to some degree, degrees of violence that they were subjected to. I will say that the first 2 months or so were very challenging. Of course, as you mentioned, I'm an African diaspora studies major, so I'm not new to studying trauma or enslavement. But being at a historic site where I knew that trauma, like what I've studied, had taken place on the grounds that I was stepping on, it was and has been challenging. But it's work that needs to be done. It's work that nobody would be doing if I wasn't here and if others in the space weren't here. So someone has to do it. Someone has to set aside, well, really rather channel the emotions that this conjures up, thinking about how people were suffering and how people were deprived of their labor for generations, and how we continue to see the ramifications of that 200 years later. It's ongoing, and it's work that has to continue for generations to come. We see that there are efforts now to restrict people from learning about history, like this very history we're learning. And unless we have people at the forefront of the fight, I mean, there's going to continue to be pushback, and there's going to continue to be history that's overlooked. So as far as research itself, the hard research of looking into documents regarding enslaved persons, wills have been some of the most valuable resources to look at. Wills and deeds for enslaved persons who died 20 to 30 years later, because often they stayed relatively close. Often they detailed family members, and we were able to trace back names to plantations or to sites of enslavement. I don't know if there were other aspects of the question that I need to touch on.
No, it was two questions really, and it was one, how are you affected by it? But the other one is about that. It's about how do you dig into research which has so many gaps, really, in a way, and then the corollary to that is, how do you best then represent individuals in exhibits and tours who are undocumented in that way? How do you, and this is a question that we get to, how do you deal with people who aren't there, as it were, when you're trying to make sure that you remind people that there were 4 million enslaved people, but what's left of them in a documentary sense is minuscule, photographic sense even less so. I don't know how you think about that.
Yeah. So first of all, this is where it becomes important to recognize that this historic space would not be here without enslaved persons. So we would not be able to grapple with any of this material history without the persons that were enslaved here, for better or for worse. And so we have to have a somewhat objective view of the material space that we're dealing in, and of the historical significance of the people who would have constructed this space and maintained it. And it does often feel like chasing or trying to transcribe the words of ghosts, since we don't have their words to refer to. So with things like the garden, I mean, this is an effort to memorialize, in a sense, one of the persons enslaved here. But we can't say for sure that she would have wanted a garden, or what roses she would have wanted in the garden, or what she would have wanted to do with the property itself. All that we can do is be as objective as possible, continue to use this platform, which is a historic site that remains from 1796, 1795. We can use this to learn more about the stories of enslaved persons here and elsewhere.
Yeah. Just a couple more, and then I'm aware of the time, but somebody did just come back with Bell. It's column 4. They can read better than we can, apparently. Fugitive from the state is how they're reading that in that column, which is interesting in and of itself. Another way to go down, another road to go down in terms of research. The stone bead that was found there, is that something that was, do you think that's a jewelry piece, or perhaps a piece one of those homeland sort of, I can't think of the word, spiritual caches sort of thing, maybe, that somebody left somewhere? And how do you know that it was from someone enslaved? Location of where it was found or some other reason?
Yeah, yeah. So we do know it because of location. It was found in the general area of the swept yard, and the type of bead that it is. I can't say exactly the composition of the material, but the type and the color of the bead does indicate to us, along with the location that it was found, that it was the possession of an enslaved person. And so we do believe that it was a bead that would have been used for hair, so likely for some type of twist or some type of knot in a female, likely a younger enslaved female's hair. That's the bulk of what we know about it.
Right. Got two more, and then there's some comments on here which are good on Morehead's wealth and what was sparking your interest on it as well. But the Quakers, go back to that for 2 seconds. I guess the question is asking, what impact did they have on, because it's such a Quaker influence there, on surrounding people in this population in terms of freeing anybody enslaved? A big influence in that area?
Yeah. So the Quakers definitely had a large influence on not just the Piedmont area, as they were largely populated in High Point and in Winston-Salem to some degree as well. But moving further west as well, people knew that Greensboro was a place where a plantation economy would not generally thrive, where there were people who, from approximately 1820s onward, the people that populated the town were in large part against the type of slavery that the rural South would have been accustomed to. And so that made for interesting political relationships between Quakers and others to the east of the state. And that undoubtedly would have made for a space as a safe haven for enslaved persons who would have been coming through the area or were seeking the area coming from somewhere else. We know that Greensboro would have been a stop on the Underground Railroad. We know that multiple houses would have been safe havens for persons traveling from the deeper South, South Carolina, Georgia, etc. But because so much of this was secret, because so much of this was a secret society that relied on very little written evidence of the acts that they were conducting, we'll never know the extent to which the Quakers in Greensboro and in High Point and surrounding were involved in the rest of North Carolina enslavement activity.
All right, last one, and I will just tell everybody that in the chat, if you do have more questions, Julian's email's right there. So, and the other staff, and to be honest, if you want to email Bellamy Mansion staff as well, we do a lot of research in this area if you're in this part of the state, maybe. The last one, how much participation and support for the research and work do you get from descendants of the family? Which is an interesting one from our perspective too.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I don't interact with descendants of the Morehead family very often at all. I do know that much of our furniture that we have in the house, which is original to the house, came from the Moreheads. So many of the descendants of Moreheads have graciously donated that back to the museum. Others have sold it either to the museum or to other people, in which case it simply made its way to Blandwood. As far as communication about enslavement at Blandwood, by the Moorheads. I'm not too keen on their positions. I would imagine, since they're cooperative with Preservation Greensboro, that they're not sympathetic to the Confederacy or to the practice of enslavement, but I can't say too specifically how much they support or participate.
Okay. All right. Well, we could go on for ages, I think, actually. I know I could. This is fascinating. I'm really looking forward to coming in and taking the tour. I would encourage, of course, everybody to come and see a historic site, Blandwood, Bellamy, of course, I'll put a plug in for, but without support, you all know this, I know, but without support of the public and interested people, small museums and nonprofits don't make it without the supporters. We don't get a lot of money from anywhere else. So please help out everywhere you can. Throw us more questions as you'd like to. I think I got to most of them on there, but if I didn't, sorry about that. Again, Julian, this is great. Thanks so much for doing it. You've really dug into it here, and you've got an entire career, right, to get the rest of it, all the research everywhere done. It's endless.
Yeah, I'm excited to keep going. This has been a very shallow view into what we've been looking into. So there's more to come. There's more research being done constantly into not just the lives of enslaved, but what constituted existence, period, for people in the 19th century onward, and how Blandwood connects to that. So I do hope that people will come in for tours. They're $8. They're not expensive. They're very cheap for historic sites tours. So come in, get a tour. Every tour from each one of our individual docents is going to be different. We all have different backgrounds and different lenses by which we can inform our tours. So,
Right.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, well, thanks very much again. And everybody from Preservation North Carolina, thanks so much. I'm going to end the recording now. And we will see you at the next shelter, I hope, or at a historic site nearby soon. Thanks very much, Julian.